looks like it's 4:30, so let's get started. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Lisa Murray, and I am the Assistant Director of the MDI Historical Society. Welcome to Chebacco Chat Season 4, Episode 15. If you haven't been part of Chebacco Chats before, I just want to give a quick rundown on how this goes. We are using a webinar format, so please ask questions and send comments using the chat or the questions and answers feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. When you use the chat feature, you have the option to send a message to the hosts, who are Joan or myself, or to everyone, all of the fellow audience members. We'll answer questions at the end of the conversation. And Chebacco Chats are recorded and are available through our website and YouTube channel about a week after they air. So tonight we're speaking with Joan Grant, who is the author of Lydia Stories, the Carroll Family History, 1761 to 1917. In 1911, a doll is assembled from bits of clothing worn over the years by members of the Carroll family, gathering this family history into her creation. The doll, Lydia, is a gift for the newest member of the family, serving as keeper and narrator of the family history. Joan is a native of Bar Harbor, daughter of Evelyn Kittredge, grandniece of Nell Carroll Thornton, and a fourth-generation descendant of John Carroll. She is a year-round resident of Mount Desert Island, pastor, teacher, and spiritual director. As a volunteer for Acadia National Park, she has helped Lydia tell her stories at the Carroll Homestead in Southwest Harbor since 2002. Please welcome Joan as she shares her experience documenting the Carroll family history. Welcome, Joan.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Very glad to be here.
Please tell us a little bit about the background for writing Lydia Stories.
Yes, the background is that I am a great-great-granddaughter of John Carroll. I have always been exposed to different stories and legends and lore about the Carroll family. I grew up partly on the island. My father was from Bar Harbor. And I knew very much about John Carroll's homestead, which was always called the Mountain House. So over the years, I actually got to meet Nell Carroll Thornton. I got to meet Anna Beatrice Carroll, who was born there in the Mountain House. I got to see, of course, my grandmother, Sarah Tenney Carroll, who also told me stories. And over the years, as my grandmother died, I received some of her furniture, some of her records, some of her stories. And I was able, when I came back to live on Mount Desert Island after some exile in New Hampshire, I was able to visit the Mountain House when the Acadia National Park had taken it over, and the education department was now presenting it to the public. So I took some of my artifacts, some of my stories, and I approached the rangers there and said, if you were interested, I'd be willing to share some of those. So over the years, since 2002, I've been sharing those stories and the dolls and some of the other photographs from the family. And people over the years have said, you must write these down. You must write these down into a story. So I began to write them down in 2015 as my two granddaughters were born. I knew I wanted to hand on the family stories and the lore that were given to me, to them, as well as to their dad, which is my son, Ben. And I wanted to honor the women who had put together these stories and written them down from oral interviews with their grandparents, with their aunts and uncles over the years in Southwest Harbor. I wanted to honor Nell Carroll Thornton. Primarily, she was the inspiration for compiling the stories and the genealogy of the family. She went back to Ireland, to where John Carroll was born in 1926, all by herself. to research the family history in Borrisoleigh in the county of Tipperary. And then in 1933, she compiled those into a notebook, and they have been handed on to the descendants of the Carroll family. The notebook was renewed in 1960 before all of the members of the family that had been born since 1933 and did not get a copy of Nell's first notebook. So it was reissued in old mimeographed ink in 1960. And that's the version that I have right here in my desk, and that began the inspiration and the telling of the stories according to how Nell had written them down. So the other piece of wanting to do this was to share the stories as story, not insofar as telling historical facts and just writing down the names and the dates of their lives, but to tell their stories, to bring them alive. And that brought me to the doll Lydia, who was sewn in 1911. She's the doll on the right-hand side in the kind of mauve-colored dress. She's with her brother and sister dolls, Billy in the middle and Susan on the left. But Lydia was born in 1911 to help find a name for the newest Carroll granddaughter, the third child of Sarah Tenney Carroll, born in Tremont, in Bass Harbor, in the town of Tremont in 1911. She was sewn by Rebecca Carroll, her grandmother, for Sarah's children, all of her children. Those were the three dolls for Sarah's three children. And Lydia was born in 1911 for the newest child. So the family story is that Lydia was stitched together with remnants of all of the fabrics, from pieces from all the fabrics of the clothes that had been worn, the dresses, the pants, the jackets, all from the previous ancestors that had been handed down through the years. And when Lydia was assembled, she was given the mission by Rebecca to tell the stories from all of those ancestors to the newest grandchild, whose name Lydia discovered when she saw her for the first time in the Kittredge house in Tremont. Lydia discovered that her name was going to be Evelyn. And there's a picture of the Kittredge house, which still exists. Some of you may have even been in it. It was wonderfully, wonderfully renovated by Bill and Tina Baker in the 1990s, early 2000s. That is the house where my grandmother lived and where I spent many, many weeks of fun and adventure growing up in the 1950s. So Lydia came to live there. This is a picture, as you're seeing now, of the Kittredge house on the far right, across the bridge, across where the Bass Harbor Marsh comes out into Bass Harbor. You can also see a man standing on the dike, which regulated the flow of the water in and out of the Bass Harbor Marsh in order to grow salt hay up in the marsh. So Lydia came to live there with Evelyn, and as soon as Evelyn was in the toddler stage, I think we have a picture of her, if you have one. If you don't,
I don't know if I do.
If you don't have that picture, okay. Well, as soon as Lydia and Evelyn got together, they began to learn how to speak with each other. And so Lydia began to tell the story of the John Carroll family and the Jacob Lurvy family to Evelyn. And that's how the book is set up, and that's how we moved from the Kittredge family story of their home and their family to John Carroll.
And is that Lydia behind you?
It is Lydia behind me. She wanted to come and just see what this was all about. And she's very curious. She's 112 years old, so she has to take it easy during the afternoons. But she's very active in terms of coming to the Mountain House to help tell the stories.
So you mentioned John Carroll. Can you tell us his story in the early families living at Mountain House?
Well, John Carroll was born in Ireland. And unfortunately, we don't have a picture of John Carroll. We just have a picture of his home that he built in 1825. But we know that he was born in Borrisoleigh in the County Tipperary in Ireland in 1790. We actually know from his oral accounts to his wife Rachel about his grandfather Samuel and his grandmother Hannah Lloyd Carroll, and that they were prosperous, living on a farm that was actually prosperous in Tipperary. And that's where John Carroll learned how to grow things, all love for agriculture, for gardens, for herbs, for fruit trees, and what he would bring with him when he arrived finally in Southwest Harbor. We know about John's father, William, who studied to be a priest at the University of Dublin. And in the last throes of that formation, he left and decided not to become a priest. He married Elizabeth Cook, who was a Protestant, a descendant of Protestant families in Ireland, which is, you might imagine, was fairly controversial. And they brought up their son, John, to have a very open mind about all kinds of things that were of the inner life, as well as how to be open and responsible civically in the town of Borrisoleigh. But John Carroll got involved in a skirmish against some English soldiers and tax collectors in 1812 and was about to be arrested for treason and therefore had to leave Ireland. So they decided to send him to Newfoundland, which was where Elizabeth Cook Carroll had some relatives. And so in 1814, on May 24th, John Carroll embarked on a ship from Waterford, Ireland, all by himself, with one trunk to his name, and landed safely in St. John's, Newfoundland, by the end of the summer of 1814. He found some work. He found his relatives, the Burke family, living in St. John's. He found that he didn't really like being on the ocean, having never been born near the ocean or grown up on it. He found some work as a mason because he had lived in a stone house in Borrisoleigh. And so he had learned from the people who took care of it, the men who came to repair it, the art of masonry. So he learned to make his way in Newfoundland through the profession of masonry, because there were lots of Irish young people coming there that needed housing. In that course of doing his work, he met a young man named Michael Bolger, who was a carpenter, and they really became best of friends for the rest of their life. The one thing that happened to him in Newfoundland that caused him to leave, and he was there about 6 years, he was part of the going to the ice seal hunt adventures of the Newfoundland fishermen. When they were in the early spring, they couldn't go out to codfish yet. They had to do something else. So they went seal hunting up in the Labrador Straits. And John Carroll and his crew of 5 men were stranded on an iceberg for 3 days out in the North Atlantic, having had successfly shot 5 seals, but the ice they were standing on separated in some kind of a meltdown of the ice flow they were working out of, and it had floated off into the North Atlantic for 3 days while the men ran around to keep warm and ate some of the seal meat and got the seal pelts around them to keep them warm. And at the 4th day, they had actually laid down that night to go to sleep on the end of the 3rd day, thinking that they were going to just freeze to death. So they laid down, but in the middle of the night, one of the men woke up and woke the rest of the men up because he could sense that the wind had changed and was now blowing that ice floe back to the mothership and back to the rest of the ice where the ships were. And so they did. The wind blew them back, and in the 4th day, they were able to get back to the mothership. Not any of the men died of hypothermia or suffered frostbite, but John Carroll said that was it. He was no longer going to stay in Newfoundland. It was too cold, too dangerous. And he and Michael set sail on a ship for, they thought, Washington, D.C., so they could have work as masons and carpenters rebuilding our capital after the English had burned Washington, D.C. in 1812. So they got as far as Great Cranberry Island, where they had another mishap where they were arrested because one of the ships they had sailed south on had apparently a false owner. Somebody had stolen a ship in St. John's, and they couldn't find the owner of that ship. But because Michael and John had arrived with that ship, they were arrested for stealing the ship as the first thing that happened to them in the United States. Maine had just become a state in 1820 in March. So they were taken to Portland, and they represented themselves. John represented themselves in the court before the judge. They were exonerated. The judge sent them back to Great Cranberry Island where they had been arrested. And there they stood in the late fall of 1820 with no way to get to Washington, D.C. It was hurricane season on the Atlantic seaboard. And the owner of the ship that was a legitimate owner was John Manchester from Northeast Harbor. And he allowed them to stay on the ship if they could pay him room and board. So they needed work. They got a committee from Southwest Harbor came out and pled their case to come and build houses for them, a mason and a carpenter in Southwest Harbor. More families were moving to Maine and to Mount Desert Island, from Massachusetts particularly. So they went to work until the ground froze. And then in the winter, in January, John Carroll was working in a lumber crew. His axe slipped as he was cutting trees down at the base of Beech Mountain and cut his foot very severely. They wrapped him up in a big blanket in an ox cart, and they took him to Jacob Lurvie's house on the Lurvie Spring Road at the base of Beech Mountain. And there he was tended to. The one doctor on the island, Dr. Kendall Kittredge, was brought up and over Beech Mountain from Soamesville to sew up his wound. They were successful. He saved his leg. And then Dr. Kittredge told him he had to stay for that, at least a couple of weeks or months with the Jacob Lurvie family. And while he was there, he met one of Jacob Lurvie's daughters named Rachel. And they fell in love and were married in 1822 on Christmas Eve. So there's the first picture we have of that generation, which is Rachel Lurvie Carroll. They were married in 1822 and lived together till 1867. They needed a place to live, and they wanted to move out of her home where they had stayed for the first few years of their marriage. And John Carroll walked down what we now know as the Fernal Point Road and looked up at the side of what was then called Dog Mountain and saw the ledges. It was not forested on the east side facing the Somes Sound. It was ledges. It had blueberry and sweet fern and lots of lichen, but it didn't have a large spruce and fir forest on it. The mountain behind it was all forested. But he looked up at those ledges and he said to Rachel, "That's where I want to build my house." Well, they went to the town, and the town said, "That's silly. There's nobody out there. There's not even a road out there. You can't build on the side of a mountain." And they said, well, they decided, if John Carroll said, "I want to build my house there, so I'm a mason. I have help from a carpenter." And they looked at the land grant records from Francis Bernard that was recorded on Salem Town Jr.'s map of Mount Desert Island in 1808. And they found that nobody had claimed this lot number 115. So they said, well, if you can build a house there, then it's yours. And that's what he proceeded to do. For the next 3 years, he worked on building this house, cutting into the granite, getting granite, pouring some granite from the side of Dog Mountain, bringing it in. He wanted a cellar. He knew that would be his refrigerator. So he built a cellar with a foundation with granite and fieldstone. He cleared all of the top part of a meadow. He put up the walls with beautiful wood lathing and horsehair plaster. That was the first house for an ordinary family in Southwest Harbor to have plaster on the walls. So he built a virtual palace that stands there. The original house has that large two-flue chimney on the east side. There it is. Yeah, that's the front door we're looking at. And he built the front door, he said, big enough so a decently dignified funeral could happen there. You could get a casket in and out of that front door. But that was about the only time they used the front door. Their door that they used day in and day out was the back door. That actually shows the house when the addition in 1850 was added with the second flue, the second chimney. Jacob Carroll was their only son. They had 6 children, and he inherited the house when his father died in 1867. They deeded the lots that had become rightfully owned by John to Jacob, with the one provision that Rachel could stay in the house as long as she lived, and if she wanted to. So Jacob asked her right away if she'd like to move into Southwest Harbor, where there was more people, there was more going on, the social life was better, the church life, the civic life was more, things were happening in town. And Rachel said, don't ever ask me to move from this house. This is my house. I've given my life energy to it. And stay here all my years. So Jacob agreed. He had become a sea captain. At age 14, he had left their subsistence farm. He had gone to sea with their blessing, and Rachel gave it to him provided he didn't drink any alcohol. And he agreed, went off to sea, became a sea captain by 1865. And in 1870, he was successfully a sea captain. He owned part of his own ship. And he came back to help his mother live on a subsistence farm, which he found to be very difficult alone as a single man. He'd not married through this first 40 years of his life until he met the wife of a cousin, an Enoch Lurvy, that the two, Rebecca Whitmore and Enoch Lurvy, had been married right after the Civil War. And unfortunately, Enoch Lurvy was lost at sea in a shipwreck after they'd only been married a very few years, and had a baby on the way who was never to meet his birth father. So Jacob asked Rebecca, who was also a professional seamstress for the town of Southwest Harbor, if she would like to marry him and live at the mountain house. And she agreed. She was fortunately only 27. She wasn't 40, because they lived together there and had 10 children in the mountain house. And there should be a photo. This is the only photo that they all were ever pictured in. It was an itinerant photographer going up the road in 1888, probably, who asked them if they wanted to have their picture taken. And they're standing at their back door on the wooden platform in front of the Carroll Homestead, known as the Mountain House. When my generation came along, we had to learn their names to get our supper. So I'm going to sing it for you, because that's what happens when you get to be in the Carroll family. Their names are Ian and Nell and Gert and Fan, John and Kate and Alice, Sade and Grace, Lloyd and Ma, Pa and Anna Beatrice. There they are. The little girl on the far left is Sarah Tenney Carroll. That's my grandmother. So she's about 8 years old in that photo. And there she is a beautiful young woman. Everybody agreed that Sarah was the beauty of the family. She had darker hair. Most of them were reddish, auburnish, with that Irish kind of look. And Sarah took after her maternal side and her maternal great grandmother, Hannah Boynton. So she was named Sarah Tenney Carroll because Jacob had been doing some masonry work in addition to his captaincy on the seas. He was doing some masonry work in Blue Hill and for Nathan Tenney, who was a doctor there. And they became good friends. Sarah actually went to Blue Hill Academy in high school and boarded there with them. So she married in 1903 to Wilfred Kittredge, one of the great-grandsons of Dr. Carroll Kittredge. And that's when she moved into that Kittredge house where the story began, having her family begin in 1905, 1907, and then 1911. They would have another son, but 1920. So that's outside the bounds of the book. There's all the one-room schoolhouse in Norwood Cove was right off the Vernal Point Road, probably on the opposite side of the road from what is now the golf course. That's the contingent of when there were the most Carroll kids of that generation who attended the one-room schoolhouses. 7 of them are in that picture. My grandmother is in the first row, the smallest little girl, third in from the left-hand side. There she is. That's my grandmother Sarah. Her older sister Alice is right beside her. Gertrude is behind Alice. Nell, and the reason they only had that one picture of the Carroll family that we looked at before was that the little girl Fanny, who's about 14, not quite 14 in this picture, probably 13. She is right in the middle behind the little boy with the beret on. She dies in 1890 of consumption, which is tuberculosis. And so they never, ever had their picture taken again. It was the only time. And this is a wonderful photograph that has her also in it in 1888. So it must have been the same photographer. Yeah. He went to the schoolhouse and then he went up the hill, the Carroll Hill, to the mountain house and took the pictures. This is one of the wonderful pictures of members of that family as they had grown up. And it's also wonderful because it shows you behind them how open the ledges were before all of the growth of the trees had come back. So now when you visit the Carroll Homestead, it won't look like that at all. The split rail fence is gone, but it also has become forested and you can't see out to the Somme Sound, which is what John Carroll could see. He would be devastated to know he couldn't see the Somme Sound from there. But this is the second John Carroll's wife. Viola is the left and the woman on the left, and these are her 3 children. The woman in the middle is Gracie, and the woman on the right is Alice. And they're sporting beautiful straw hats because one of their sisters, Kate, went to work in Lowell, Massachusetts at a straw hat factory. They loved being there. They loved living there. This is a wonderful picture because it shows the house probably a year or so after the previous picture. First, it shows the barn, which is unusual because the barn has fallen down. So you can't go see the way the barn looks. You can see its foundation, but you can no longer visit the barn. Wasn't a really, really big barn. It was accommodating just a couple of cows, some sheep, a pig, a goat every once in a while, chickens, lots of chickens. But it provided them all of, supplemented what they could grow on as a subsistence farm. Shows you the shape of the wood pile. Jacob insisted that they run the household like he ran his ship. So everything was very neat and clean. I don't know if they were all born as Virgos, but they all kept good order and nobody complained.
So how did the Carroll family transition into the 20th century?
Yeah,
Whoop,
it was a
well, I'll go
hard,
back to this.
yeah, okay, yeah, it was a hard change. At one point, well, Rachel wanted to stay there all her life, which she did. She died in 1881 at the age of 90. But when Jacob married Rebecca, and they lived there for the 20 years, when he died in 1899, his son, their son John, the second John Carroll, asked his mother Rebecca, "Would you like to stay in the mountain house and continue to live there while I move in with my growing family?" And Rebecca said, "No." She said, "I would like to go into Southwest Harbor where there's electricity, where there's indoor plumbing, where there's perhaps central heating, where there's life, where there's social life." So they were very isolated out there. And at one point in the early 1900s, the family got together to try to figure out, should they modernize the house? Should they bring in electricity? Route 102 had been built. That wasn't there when John Carroll first built the house. They could bring in electricity. They could probably put a pipe from the well into the kitchen, which they decided not to do. And Nell Carroll Thornton, the oldest daughter of Jacob and Rebecca, said to them, "Don't modernize this house. Just keep it the way it is built. It's solid. It will last. It's a piece of our family heritage and history. It's a piece of Southwest Harbor history. It will show people how our 19th century folk came and lived and worked, played, prayed, and lived their lives close to the land. And it will be something that you will appreciate to tell your children, and you can take them and show them this house." And she said also, someday people are going to want to see real authentic houses from the 19th century, and there are not going to be many left. So save this whole area, this whole house, this whole story to hand on both to our town, to our family, our town, and to the island.
When did Acadia National Park take it over?
1982, after a few
Oh,
years of negotiating, the Alice Carroll's daughter, Virginia Young, inherited the deed to the house, and she and other family members who stayed in Southwest Harbor tried to figure out how to keep the house safe and to keep the contents safe and to bring repairs that were needed to the house. And they just knew they didn't have the resources or the knowledge of how to keep a 19th century house operating and safe. So they approached the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, who then approached Acadia National Park. And the park took it over in 1982, they own all the other land around it. So it made sense that it would become part of the Acadia National Park. The educational department took it as a challenge to begin to offer it as sort of a Sturbridge Village or an experience to fourth graders in local schools who still come every spring to the Carroll Homestead and celebrate a whole day there, learning about crafts, learning about the stories, learning about what life was like in the 19th century.
yeah.
So the second John Carroll's family, he had 6 children there at the mountain house, 4 boys and 2 girls. The previous generation had 8 girls and 2 boys. So a lot of the work, farming and the growing work and the subsistence farm was done by the women all through those years of the first 2 generations. This shows the beginning of the Carroll drugstore on the main street before it moved around to Village Way. It was established in 1938. Philip was born in 1904, so he was 34 years old. He had 5 daughters, and 2 of them are actually still with us. And I visited them, and they have a copy of the book. So I'm hoping that I've kept all the stories straight, and they're going to agree with the way I've told them. So that was the beginning of moving John Carroll and his family into Southwest Harbor. They had an apartment over the store, which is where John began to live in his older age after his children grew up. After 1917, the town of Southwest Harbor tore down the one-room schoolhouses and they built the Harbor House. So that was where all the elementary school children up through 8th grade were required to come to school there. So when John Carroll's youngest daughter, Rachel, was 5 years old, they thought that was a little too far for her to have to walk every day in and out to the Harbor House. So that's when they moved into the Southwest Harbor year-round, only in the winters, and nobody lived year-round in the mountain house after 1917. They all went out there in the summers because they loved being there.
So you have done an incredible amount of research on this book, and do you have any advice for others who may be doing similar familial research?
The best advice is to go talk to the people who are still with us, and your aunts and your uncles, your grandparents, if you have those wonderful, that resource, because it's orally, the stories are what bring our history alive. So as much as you can do with oral interviews and asking questions and looking through family Bibles and books and records that you have locally in your family. If you don't have that incredible resource, then go to your local libraries or wherever the local is where your family is from and ask them for any kind of resources that have been donated by other members of that community so that you can begin to build your story. And it is a story. The book Lydia Stories are the stories that were handed down, but they're also knit together in a way that I just had to ask for help from all those ancestors to give me inspiration to put those stories together so that they created a flow. There are the archives of our National Library of Congress or National Archives themselves in Washington, D.C. The digital archives in our Southwest Harbor Library are amazing. And kudos to Charlotte Morrill and all those Meredith Hutchins who helped to put those together.
And lastly, where can we purchase a copy of Lydia Stories?
Well, Lydia Stories has a website, and it's called lydia-stories.com. So you can purchase them directly from me through that website. You can find them at the Southwest Harbor Public Library. They were very much agreed to have those books available, both the hardcover and the softcover. And they're also available at the Carroll drugstore. So you can actually drop by the Carroll drugstore and see a copy of it and take a look and see if it inspires you to get a copy and to learn about the Carroll story, but to learn about the human story that we all have that is bigger than any one family.
I also want to add that Joan will be speaking about the book at the Southwest Harbor Library next Tuesday, December 5th at 5:30. And then in March, she'll be at the Jessup Library as well.
That's right.
And I thank you very, very much. I highly recommend this book. It tells not just the story of her family, but it's really the story of the history of MDI. I mean, it's the things I was struck by. I think about the pressures that your family was facing at the turn of the century. I think of as a lot of the pressures that the people on the outer islands were facing. But I don't think about people living in these rural pockets of the island because to me, they're not rural anymore. But at the time, without a road and electricity, it was as much of a struggle for them just to get to school.
That's right.
As some of the folks on the outer islands.
You're right. Yes. And I encourage everybody to to go see the Carroll Homestead, walk
Yeah.
around there, because the spirit of this family is still there, and they would love to have to host anybody who comes there with the respect for what they had done and how they had lived their lives.
Do any of the attendees have any questions that you'd like to ask Joan before we end? Well, I thank you all. I've recorded this and we'll have it up on our website within a week. And I welcome you to our next Chebacco Chats, which is next Thursday at 4:30, we'll be talking to Jim Reverts, who is the author of a book called Jordans of the Pond, which is another history of the family, who formed the Jordan Pond House. And you can go to our website to register for that. And I do have a chat here. Wendy Dolliver says, thank you very much. So thank you. I appreciate it. And if you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, we're just at MDI History there, or go to our website at any time to look at our upcoming events. And I will send you an email with the link to this program later on in the next week. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you all.
Good night.
Good night.